Hello and welcome to the channel. I'm Lauro Miller and I make videos about programming. Today we'll have a quick discussion about null and undefined values in JavaScript. The discussion itself is quite quick, so we can jump right into Notion, but before, just don't forget there is a link in the description you can use to access the online environment and practice the things we discussed today. I think it's going to be a fairly quick discussion because there is not much to talk about null and undefined. We will just briefly discuss the cases where undefined happens, the cases when null happens, and also some of the common, maybe not properties, but characteristics, right? Characteristics, because they actually don't have any properties. So some of the common characteristics between undefined and null. Back at the IDE, let's create a new file here, and we're going to call this undefined.js. Now, when does undefined happen? Well, the first one is if we do not initialize a variable, right? So if we say let a, for example, and then we simply console.log a, we're going to get undefined as the result. Let's save this. And here at the terminal, we're going to run node undefined.js. We get just undefined. Another case when undefined happens is that if there is a missing property in an object. Or actually, even better, non-existing property, right, in an object. So if we try to, let's say, const person is equal to age 30, and we try to console.log the person.firstname, then this is also going to output undefined. Now, the third case where undefined happens, or by default, is if we do not pass enough parameters to a function. So let's say some undefined or missing, right, function parameters. So let's call this, for example, function too many args or too many params. I mean, there is a difference between the two. Sometimes or most of the times they are used interchangeably, but I mean, we'll discuss when we talk about functions. We actually discuss a bit of naming nomenclature behind the scenes here, and we understand the actual difference between arguments and parameters and whether there is any. But let's say here that we will say simply arg0, arg1, arg2, and arg3, and we will console.log this whole thing, arg0, and we're going to console.log, go ahead and do 1, 2, 3 as well, 1, 2, and 3. And here we are going to call the function too many args with just 1 and 2, or actually let's pass two strings here to avoid a bit of confusion, ABC, and then CDE. If I save this and execute in the console, then you see that the first two arguments are populated, but the other two, the last two, are actually undefined. And the fourth case where this happens is if we try to print the return value of a function which doesn't return anything. Return value of functions which do not return anything, like so. So if I were to actually pass this result to a variable, let's say my var, and this is going to be the function call, which means that when we call this function, we would assign the return value of this function to the variable my var. If I console.log this, console.log my var, I will also get undefined. So I'll just erase this to clear a little bit the output so that we don't have too many undefineds. Once I save this and execute it again, we have undefined here, right? So these four come from the function call at the bottom. This, when we call this, we actually do 4 console logs, and then we have the fifth one, which is the undefined return value. These are the default cases where undefined happens. Of course, if I want to assign the undefined value directly to a function, or not to a function, sorry, but to a variable or to any property of an object, I can do that, is no problem. But by default, JavaScript behind the scenes is going to assign this undefined value in these 4 cases. Now let's switch to null. I'll create a new file here, null.js, and we will discuss when null happens. I'll not go into too many cases here because there are not too many cases where null is the default value. But remember that when we had this string thing with the match regular expression, so let's say z here, and I'm gonna say abc, for example, abc, And of course, this is not going to match. If I were to console.log the result, and I save this and I run node null.js, then I get null as the result. Also, if I do something like this, console.log object.get prototype of object.prototype, if we also execute this, then we get a null as a result. Now, the construct null, it has a semantic meaning. So it means that there is a value which is purposefully missing, right? While the undefined one stands more for the fact that some value was not initialized. The null construct is, or the null value, you can think of it as more in the sense that a value is intentionally missing or it is intentionally null. Now, whether you want to adopt this semantics in your code or not, there is no, let's say, widespread best practices here. I think we have two different constructs which represent a missing value, and I normally tend to use null if I want to explicitly say that that value is, or that property is not populated, and the undefined is going to say more reserved to the cases where the values are not initialized themselves. But yeah, that's more a matter of personal preference. I mean, you're also free to choose. Just, I think it's important to be consistent, right? It's just important to be consistent about how you use a certain construct in JavaScript so that your code doesn't start to get too messy or too confusing. So we're done with null. Let's discuss some common characteristics, and mainly the one that I want to discuss is the fact that they have no properties whatsoever. So these values in JavaScript, they really have no properties. Let's say const undef, something like so, undefined. Here, I cannot access any property of undefined. It doesn't have a length. It doesn't have any other property that I can imagine or that I can think of in terms of object. So it doesn't have anything, right? If I try to access a property of an undefined or of a null value, I'm going to get an exception. I'll save this and let's come here and we'll say node common.js, and we get an exception because it cannot read property length of undefined. If I change undefined to null here, it is the same, right? I try to run and then I get again an error. It cannot read the property length of null. One way of going around this limitation is that we can just add a couple of checks, right? So if, let's say, undef, I can simply execute it like this, and because of type coercion and truthy and falsy values, then I can ensure that, well, at least undef is going to be defined. So I can console.log here, let's say undef, or maybe let's take a better name. Let's call this variable myvar, right? So if myvar, I'm going to say myvar is defined, right? Else console.log myvar is falsy. I mean, here maybe the correct would be truthy, right? Truthy here, and falsy otherwise, because if my var is 0, then this is going to output my var is falsy. So I save this, let's run this again, and we'll say my var is falsy. Yeah, exactly. But we can actually be a little bit more explicit and say if my var is different than null, and my var is different than undefined, then my var is defined, else my var is undefined, right? Or is either null or undefined. Right, so if I save this, then you will see that, yeah, this is going to output the first one because my var is 0, so it is defined. Now if I pass a string here, let's say ABC, and I save this, and that's going to lead to the same case. And now here I could even try something like this. If type of my var equals to string, then I can console.log myvar.length, right? So I add this quick check here to ensure that I'm going to print the length only of string objects. If I pass 1, 2, 3, for example, then this is not going to be printed to the screen because my var is of type number. If I save this, I just don't output anything. If now I come back here and I surround this with single quotes or with double quotes or with backticks, and I run this, then I get the length of my string. So these checks here, they can be useful in JavaScript when we start working with TypeScript, where we have a statically typed language, or we have statically typed variables. Then all these checks are going to be considerably reduced. So the number of checks we need to execute is going to be much less than what we need to do when we are working with JavaScript. And that's exactly because we will know beforehand whether my var is a number, is a string, is undefined or can be undefined, can be null. We will know all of this beforehand because we are going to explicitly say what is the type of this variable in TypeScript. That's it for today. I know, quick discussion, not much to talk about. I mean, null and undefined are pretty much null and undefined, but it's important to know what happens when we have these values in our program and where they can come from. In the next video of the JavaScript introduction series, we'll cover the last primitive type, symbols. If you don't want to miss that, you know what to do. Subscribe to the channel and you will get a notification when the video is out. Thanks for your time, and I'll see you in our next video. Bye bye.